What was the situation in Idlib before this all happening? This all sort of uprising, or what can we call it? So I don't know how to call it. It wasn't a revolution. It wasn't anything. It was
No.
just because these guys came to look. Just remember what has happened in Syria. They didn't have any heavy weapons, and they came with just small weapons. A small group of 20,000 forces, mostly not that much trained to fight a war with an army that was in Syria and was prepared and was they had everything to fight back. And but before going there, what has happened in Idlib? You've mentioned that Russia somehow convinced the government in Syria to get along with what has happened with the situation of Idlib. It seems to me that Idlib was closer to Turkey than to the
Yes.
government. And how did Turkey facilitate that?
Yeah. So Turkey, which is in NATO, of course, Turkey allowed these terrorists to come in to Syria into Idlib and really supported those terrorist groups in Idlib, along with Qatar. Again, Qatar, uh, its role for the West was to fund Al Qaeda, and that Qatar was happy to do it because they share a lot of the ideology of Al Qaeda, as does Saudi Arabia, right? So, and they supported it too. The UAE supported it as well, but Qatar was really the big funder for Al Qaeda. But Turkey also helped the terrorists in Idlib. Essentially, all these countries and the U.S. too helped make Idlib this hotbed for the regime change. And in this case, it happened to be that they partnered with these terrorist groups for that. Um, and again, this groundwork was being laid for years and years. I mean, basically, every time I'm interviewed, I mention this article that people have to read and have to keep in mind by Seymour Hersh from 2007 in the New Yorker magazine called The Redirection. And what Seymour Hersh was saying then, and this makes sense, we just commemorated the anniversary of 9/11 yesterday, right? Seymour Hersh said in 2007 that by 2005, the Bush administration had gone from having, an ostensible war against Al Qaeda to supporting Al Qaeda and other terrorist groups to engage in regime change operations in places like Syria, hopefully, ultimately Iran, uh, Libya as well. And so the groundwork for the war against Syria began in 2005. I mean, you could probably go back even further. I mean, and we talk about this in the book. The first regime change after World War II, the U.S. Performed was in Syria in 1946. They overthrew the president then. Um, but again, in terms of the modern day attempt to overthrow Assad, Assad the Younger, it began in 2005. And so they were cultivating these groups. Once they overthrew Gaddafi in Libya, the West, including Turkey, helped facilitate arms shipments to the terrorists in Syria. And this began the war against Assad in earnest. That raises Seymour Hersh's other articles. So Hersh was writing for the New Yorker in 2007, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. But then he published an article which really ended his mainstream career in the West as a journalist, and that was um, what is it? Red Lines and Rat Lines, something like that, in which he talked about this rat line that they set up from Libya to Syria to start supporting these terrorist groups. Again in 2011, and that's when the not uprising, because these were groups brought in from the outside into Syria. And they did take advantage of some legitimate, peaceful indigenous protests, but they exploited those to start physically, violently attacking the government and the people. And that's what happened. The other, more specific thing that happened was al-Jilani, who was in ISIS. He was a leader of ISIS in Iraq before this happened, and he was captured in Iraq for attacking U.S. forces, and he was imprisoned in a military U.S. military prison. Well, at some point, he's allowed to leave that prison and go into Syria, and he would become the leader of al-Qaeda that was backed by the West. Clearly, he had become an asset of the United States, and he is to this moment. He's now the leader of Syria. So that was so this was all planned. It was, and again, to underscore how this wasn't an indigenous uprising. At one point, the Syrian ambassador to the UN said that Syria had collected passports amongst the foreign fighters from 101 different countries. There's not even 200 countries in the world, or about 200. So half the countries of the world had foreign fighters in Syria fighting against Assad. This was a world war against Syria. And there is a book, actually, we cite in our book, called The World War Against Syria. I mean, it was. Just like there was a world war against Congo in the late 1990s. And there's a book about that too. These are things you're not going to learn in high school, okay? In your civics class or your geography class. But these were world wars that were fought for geopolitical gain. And the victims are those who live in countries like Syria. But that's it. But go to those Seymour Hersh articles. I mean, he was saying this was happening, and it happened,
Today, Syria is, in my opinion, is of concern not just for Iran and Russia, but also for China as well. As you mentioned, there are many people from different ethnicities, countries coming to Syria and being part of the government in Syria, which they're not originally from Syria.
Right.
And
they don't speak Arabic. I mean, you have a third of the fighters for HTS are foreign fighters who have no connection to Syria, don't care about Syria, don't care about the Syrians, don't even speak their language. By the way, even al-Jilani, he does speak Arabic, but not with a Syrian accent, which is very evident to the people of Syria. Yeah, but yeah, you had the Uyghurs out of China, and they vowed to go back to China and cause trouble there. And I'm sure the West will be very happy to support them doing it. Just like the West was very happy to support the terrorists in Chechnya against Russia. I mean, this is U.S. foreign policy. It's not to fight terrorism, it is to spread terrorism. And it's, it's funny or not funny, I don't know, Trump, when he was running for president in 2016, he talked about this. He said Obama created ISIS. Okay, that may be an overstatement, but he was on to something there, right? So was, of course, Tulsi Gabbard talked about this too, even during her confirmation hearing, right, for her new intelligence position. You don't really hear them talking about that much anymore. You now have Trump shaking the hand of al-Jilani. Al-Jilani is in New York City as you and I speak. It would like having bin Laden in New York City. And he's speaking at the United Nations. I mean, if Americans understood what their country has done, again, even in light of 9/11, they would be horrified. Now, a lot do know, or they suspect it, but it's Nima. It's something. I mean, George Orwell would really. I mean, he wouldn't have to write a book of fiction now. He would just have to catalog what's happening. I mean, this is 1984 stuff. This is, it's really an amazing time we live in, and not a good one.
Who has the upper hand right now in Syria, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, I think Israel does. I think Israel has, according to plan. And by the way, they admitted, I think in 2019, there was a military, and we quote him in our book. There was a military guy from Israel who admitted that they were funding like 12 different terrorist groups in Syria. I think that they have turned the situation to their advantage. They have taken over huge swaths of Syria. Very shortly after the new government took power in Syria, they put out a new map. The Minister of the Interior put out a new map of Syria, which did not include the Golan Heights. That's basically been ceded to Israel. Israel's now partnering with HTS to molest Lebanon and Hezbollah there. That's according to plan. I think Israel in the West has the upper hand, and the U.S. is still in the East, with a third of the land. And they're using the oil. They're stealing Syria's oil, stealing their grain. So the West, and Turkey's benefiting too. They have taken over part of the North. So, the Western powers, they have the upper hand in Syria. And yeah, I mean, there's horrible atrocities being committed by the new government against, again, all the groups I mentioned, the Druze, the Alawites, Shia, and Christians. One would think maybe the West would care about the Christians, but they don't. So that's of no concern. That this chaos and the violence, that's of no concern to the powers I just mentioned. They're getting their way. They're winning. And it has weakened Iran. When Iran was attacked during that so-called 12-day war, Syria was used, their airspace was used to attack Iran. That would not have happened under Assad, So the West has gotten its way. They have won in Syria. I mean, that could be, that could change. The world changes, but for the moment, they've won and are winning for sure.
You've mentioned the accent. Al-Jolani's accent is not coming from Syria. Where is he come from?
Well, his family's from Syria. I believe he was born there. Al-Jolani is his nom de guerre, and that comes from the fact that I believe he's from the Golan Heights, but he lived a lot of his life in Saudi Arabia, which makes total sense, right? Because he ends up with al-Qaeda, which, they are inspired by Wahhabism, which is a philosophy, this heretical form of Islam, that Saudi Arabia has promoted, and which is it's this toxic, philosophy, which is completely intolerant of other religions. So I believe he probably speaks with some sort of Saudi accent.
But he's coming from Saudi Arabia, but he was born and raised in
He was
Saudi
born
Arabia?
in Syria, and he ends up in Saudi Arabia. Yeah. Again, in the Golan Heights, which is occupied by Israel. So, again, where all those connections might have come from, who knows? But that's the story.
But is he running these people in Syria, or he can manage some sort of force over some factions and the other factions just do whatever they want to do. What is that? How is that working in Syria?
Yeah, well, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think he's not fully in control of his own forces. So he has about 35,000 fighters, or he did when he took over. That's probably increased, right? I'm sure they've recruited people, but originally they had about 35,000 forces when he took over. Within those 35,000, there were 26 different factions and factions within those factions. And again, 1/3 of those folks are foreign fighters, many who don't even speak Arabic, right? Many people he probably can't even speak to himself, right? Without a translator. He can't control all those people. And I think originally when he first took power, he tried to, and maybe did have some control over them. When he first came to power, he tried to portray himself as a moderate, put on a suit and a tie. He said, I used to chop, he literally said this, I used to chop people's heads off when I was young, but, just like kids in the West might get drunk when they're young or, whatever, I chop people's heads off, but I don't do that anymore. That was just youthful indiscretion, right? But, as when I was in Syria in January, a guy who will remain nameless because, he could be killed if they figured out who it was. He told me some very profound things. And one thing he told me, he said, Dan, again, things were starting to get bad when I was there, but they really didn't, become full on genocidal till March, till a couple months later. But at the time I was talking to this Syrian in January, he said, Dan, the only thing that unites these terrorists is jihad, right? Especially the foreign fighters. He said they didn't come here for a picnic. They came here for jihad, to set up this caliphate. And he told me at that moment, again, before the real bloodshed started, he said the problem that al-Jilani is going to have is that without jihad, without letting them loose on the minority groups, he probably won't be able to control them. And so it appears that he either turned them loose in March of this year or had no control to stop them. So around March 6th or 7th of this year, so there's a date certain, you can see this, the real terror started against, in this case, the Alawites in the coastal region of Syria, in which thousands of Alawites were killed. Now, to its credit, Russia did allow its military base there to be used for the Alawites to, if they could get there, to seek refuge there. Tens of thousands of Alawites went on that military base. And the Russians allowed them to leave to Russia through the base if they were able to get there, right? But that's when the real bloodshed began. And again, either because Jilani couldn't control those groups or because he had to let them have, carry out some of their bloodlust or he would lose them. But, because that's the nature of this group, again, that the West put together and supported. And, it's awful. It's awful. I mean, every friend I have in Syria wants to get out. They're in hiding, some in their homes. They won't leave their homes to even go to work, go to school. Some are hiding in the woods. And Jilani's forces, by the way, know that. They've burned down forests to try to either find people or smoke them out or kill them. It's really awful, Nima. Really, really terrible stuff.